This video is created for storytelling while the real names, locations, and identifying information have been changed to protect the privacy and dignity of the individuals and families involved. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If you ever find yourself wandering through the busy streets of Monterrey City in northern Mexico, there's one place locals will almost always point you toward with a strange mix of pride and unease. It's not a historic monument or a famous restaurant. It's a bridal boutique called Casa de Novias Elena. And inside its front display window stands something that has unsettled visitors for nearly a century. At first glance, it looks like an ordinary mannequin dressed in an elegant wedding gown, but spend more than a few seconds looking at it, and something begins to feel wrong. The mannequin is known as La Elena. Unlike typical store figures, La Elena doesn't have the stiff, lifeless appearance most mannequins do. Her eyes seem focused, almost aware, as if they're tracking movement outside the glass. Her skin has a soft, almost translucent texture. Under certain lighting, faint lines resembling veins appear beneath the surface. Even her hands are disturbingly detailed, with visible fingernails and subtle imperfections that don't look manufactured. People who pass by the shop often slow down. Some stop completely. A few walk in, pretending to browse just to get a closer look. And almost all of them leave with the same uneasy thought: that doesn't look fake. The story of La Elena begins decades ago when the boutique was first opened by a woman named Isabel Navarro. She was known in the city as a hard-working and private business owner who had built her shop from nothing. But behind her success was a quieter, more personal story. Isabel had a daughter named Lucia. Lucia was, by all accounts, the kind of person people remembered. She had a natural elegance, a love for fashion, and a talent for designing dresses that far exceeded her age. Customers who visited the boutique often found themselves speaking more with Lucia than with Isabel. She had a way of making people feel comfortable, understood. As she grew older, Lucia began designing bridal gowns, dreaming of one day taking over the shop. At 23, she announced that she was getting married. The man she chose, however, became a point of tension in the household. He was a traveling photographer named Mateo, someone who spent more time on the road than at home. Isabel didn't trust the lifestyle. She wanted her daughter to marry someone stable, someone rooted in the city, someone predictable. Lucia refused. Friends later said the arguments between mother and daughter became more frequent as the wedding approached. But despite the tension, the preparations continued. The dress was designed, the invitations were sent, everything seemed set, until the day of the wedding. That morning, Lucia was alone in her room, preparing for the ceremony. Among her belongings was a small wooden case that Mateo had given her days earlier, telling her it was a surprise meant to be opened on her wedding day. No one knows exactly what happened next. What is known is that Lucia was found dead before the ceremony could begin. There were no clear signs of violence, no witnesses, just a young bride dressed for her wedding, gone in a matter of hours. The official explanation given at the time was vague. Some said it was a sudden medical emergency. Others whispered about something far darker. Rumors spread quickly through Monterrey City, each version more unsettling than the last. One version claimed that the wooden case contained a rare poisonous insect that had bitten her. Another suggested that Lucia, overwhelmed by pressure and conflict, had taken her own life. But the truth was never confirmed. What made the situation even stranger was what happened afterwards. There was no public funeral, no formal mourning, no burial that anyone could clearly point to. For weeks, Isabel Novato closed her shop without an explanation. When she finally reopened, something inside had changed. In the front display window, standing in a full bridal gown, was a new mannequin, La Elena. At first, people assumed it was just a new addition to the shop, but it didn't take long for whispers to begin. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The mannequin's face looked almost identical to Lucia. The same delicate features, the same long lashes, the same calm, distant expression. Customers who knew Lucia personally felt a chill when they saw it. Some refused to enter the shop at all. Others came specifically because of it, drawn by curiosity they couldn't explain. When asked about the mannequin, Isabel gave only short, dismissive answers. "It's just a display piece," she would say. Nothing more. But that only made people more suspicious. The name didn't help either. La Elena loosely translated to "my little Elena," a phrase that felt deeply personal, almost maternal. Soon, the rumors took shape. People began to believe that Isabel, unable to cope with the loss of her daughter, had done something unthinkable, that she had preserved Lucia's body and placed it in the shop, turning her into a permanent bride who would never leave. It sounded impossible, but then came the stories from inside the boutique. One of the earliest came from a night cleaner who worked alone after closing hours. She claimed while sweeping near the display window, she heard a faint rustling sound behind her. At first, she ignored it, assuming it was just the building settling. But when she turned around, she froze. La Elena's position had changed. It wasn't dramatic, just slightly different. The angle of the head, the position of the hands. Enough to make her doubt her own memory. Terrified, she checked the doors, all locked, no sign of anyone else. The next morning, when staff arrived, the mannequin was back in its original position. The cleaner quit that same day. Over the years, similar stories surfaced. Employees claimed that the mannequin's posture would shift overnight. Some said its eyes looked different depending on where you stood. Others refused to touch it entirely, especially when it came time to change the dress. One employee, a young woman named Rosa, insisted that the mannequin's hand felt warm when she touched it. Not like plastic, like skin. Another worker claimed she once saw the mannequin's eyelids move. Just once, a quick, almost imperceptible blink. She never spoke about it again after that day. As the story spread, La Elena became more than just a mannequin. It became a legend. People came from other cities just to see it. Some believed it was real, others hoping to prove it wasn't. And somewhere in the middle of all that curiosity and fear, one question remained. What exactly was standing in that window? As the legend of La Pascualina spread beyond Monterrey City, it began to attract more than just curious locals. Journalists, researchers, and even medical professionals started making quiet visits to Casa de Novias Elena, each hoping to settle the question once and for all. Was it simply an incredibly well-crafted mannequin? Or something far more disturbing? One of the first detailed examinations came from a visiting anthropologist, Dr. Elena Ruiz, who had studied preservation techniques in different parts of the world. She didn't arrive with belief or skepticism, only curiosity. But after spending time closely observing the mannequin, even she admitted something felt unusual. She paid particular attention to the hands. "They're not typical," she reportedly told a colleague afterward. "The proportions, the texture, even the nail beds look natural." Dr. Ruiz noted that while high-end mannequins could achieve remarkable realism, there were still limits. Most lacked the subtle irregularities that come naturally with human anatomy. La Elena, however, seemed to possess those imperfections. Tiny asymmetries, slight discoloration in areas that would normally be exposed to sunlight, even what appeared to be faint creases near the knuckles. But despite these observations, she stopped short of making any extraordinary claims. "There's no conclusive evidence this is anything other than a mannequin," she clarified, "but it's certainly one of the most detailed I've ever seen." Her statement, instead of calming speculation, only fueled it further. Around the same time, another theory began circulating, this one grounded less in science and more in history. Some researchers pointed to rare preservation techniques used in the early 20th century, methods capable of slowing decomposition significantly when performed under controlled conditions. Stories surfaced about preserved bodies in museums that had maintained lifelike appearances for decades. People began to wonder if Isabel Navarro, driven by grief, might have sought out someone capable of such a procedure. But that theory had its own problems. Funeral specialists who examined photographs of La Elena dismissed the idea almost immediately. One of them, a veteran mortician named Carlos Mendez, publicly explained why. "A preserved body, no matter how well treated, changes over time. Skin dries, it tightens, it loses elasticity. Facial features become more rigid, not softer." He pointed out that La Elena's face appeared smooth, almost too perfect. The lips showed no signs of shrinkage. The eyelids retained a fullness that preservation techniques simply couldn't maintain over such a long period, especially in an uncontrolled environment like a storefront. And then there was the issue of exposure. For decades, La Elena had stood in a display window, subjected to heat, dust, and direct sunlight. According to Mendez, even the most advanced preservation methods would struggle under those conditions. If that were a real body, he concluded, it wouldn't look like that anymore. Still, the doubts never fully disappeared. Part of the reason was the behavior of the shop itself. Over the years, ownership of Casa de Novias Elena changed hands several times, but one thing remained consistent: the mannequin never left the window. Even more interesting was the way the owners handled questions about it. They never confirmed the rumors, but they never denied them either. Requests for interviews were often declined. On the rare occasions when someone was allowed to ask about La Elena, the answers were vague, almost playful. "It's just part of the shop," one owner once said with a smile. "People see what they want to see." That ambiguity only deepened the mystery. A university student named Mariana Torres once attempted to investigate the story as part of her research project. She tried to trace official records related to Isabel Navarro and her daughter Lucia, hoping to confirm whether the tragic story behind the mannequin had any factual basis. But her search led nowhere. Church records showed no clear documentation of Lucia's death. There were no public burial records, no official reports that matched the timeline of the supposed incident. It was as if Lucia had existed only in memory and in the rumors that followed. Mariana later admitted that this absence of evidence was more unsettling than any ghost story. It's not that the story is proven, it's that nothing disproves it either. Meanwhile, the stories from inside the boutique continued. New employees reported the same strange feelings, the same sense of being watched. Some refused to work alone during closing hours. Others avoided looking directly at the mannequin for too long. One seamstress claimed that while adjusting the dress, she felt a slight resistance, as if the arm she was moving had briefly tensed. She never touched it again. Another worker insisted that the mannequin's gaze seemed to follow her across the room, no matter where she stood. None of these accounts could be verified, but they didn't need to be, because La Elena had already become something more than an object. It had become a story people wanted to believe. Some preferred the tragic version, a grieving mother unable to let go of her daughter, preserving her in the only way she knew how. Others leaned toward logic, seeing La Elena as nothing more than an extraordinary piece of craftsmanship, enhanced by decades of imagination and rumor. And then there were those who didn't try to explain it at all. They simply stood outside the glass window, looking into the still face of the bride, and felt that quiet, unsettling sensation creeping in. The feeling that they weren't just looking at something, but something might be looking back. To this day, La Elena remains in that same position, dressed in white, untouched by time in ways that don't quite make sense. Visitors still gather, cameras still flash, and the question still lingers, unanswered. Is it just a mannequin? Or is there something else standing behind those lifelike eyes? The current owner, when asked directly, once gave a small smile and replied softly, "Some mysteries are better left exactly where they are." In the autumn of 2012, while the city of Linghai was celebrating its grand international trade festival, the riverbanks along the Qingshui River were overflowing with tourists, vendors, and performers. The entire city seemed alive with energy. But amid the noise and celebration, something unsettling quietly unfolded near Pier 7. That morning, a group of sanitation workers assigned to clean the river noticed a bulky object drifting near the edge of the water. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a pile of discarded fabric or garbage tied together. It wasn't unusual to find waste floating along the river during large public events. Still, something about it felt off. Using a hooked pole, one of the workers pulled the object closer. The moment it was lifted onto the boat, a foul, suffocating odor spread through the air. The men immediately stepped back, covering their noses. One of them hesitated, then carefully loosened part of the cloth wrapping. What he saw made his hands tremble. Beneath the layers of soaked fabric was pale human skin. Within minutes, the police were called. Officers arrived quickly, sealing off the area with warning tape and pushing back the growing crowd of onlookers. The festive noise of the city continued in the background, but inside that cordoned space, the atmosphere turned heavy and silent. When forensic specialists began unwrapping the bundle, even the most experienced among them felt a chill. It was a human torso. The body had been brutally mutilated. The head, arms, and legs were missing. Only the central portion remained, wrapped tightly as if someone had tried to conceal it as long as possible. But what disturbed the investigators the most was the abdomen. It was unnaturally swollen. At first, no one spoke. Then, one of the forensic doctors quietly confirmed what they were all beginning to suspect. The victim had been pregnant. Not just pregnant, but very close to giving birth. The realization settled heavily over the team. This was no ordinary murder. Whoever had done this had taken the life of not just one, but two. The body was transported to the forensic lab that same afternoon. A team of specialists worked carefully, documenting every detail. Despite the condition of the remains, they needed answers. Hours into the examination, the findings became clearer. There was no water or sediment in the lungs or airway, which ruled out drowning. Instead, bruising and tissue damage around the neck area indicated that the victim had been strangled before death. The pressure applied had been severe and deliberate. Further examination revealed internal trauma consistent with physical assault prior to death, but the most critical discovery came during the analysis of biological evidence. Samples collected from the body revealed DNA from multiple individuals. 3 distinct male DNA profiles were identified. This changed everything. The case was no longer just about identifying the victim, it was about tracking down multiple suspects who had direct contact with her before her death. Investigators immediately submitted the DNA profiles into the national database, hoping for a match. At the same time, they began working on the second major challenge, identifying the victim herself. Without a head, traditional identification methods were nearly impossible. No facial recognition, no dental records, no immediate way to connect her to a missing persons report. But there was one lead: the unborn child. If they could identify the father, they might be able to trace the victim through him. It was a long shot, but it was their best option. DNA from the fetus was extracted and entered into the system. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The investigation stretched on with no breakthrough. The case began to grow cold. Then, nearly a year later, something unexpected happened. During a routine police operation in a neighboring province, officers raided an illegal gambling den. Among those detained was a man named Li Qiang, a known gambler with a history of minor offenses. As part of standard procedure, his fingerprints and DNA were collected and entered into the system. Within hours, the forensic database flagged a match. Li Qiang's DNA was a direct match to the fetus found inside the victim. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team. They finally had a connection. Li Qiang was brought in for questioning immediately. Sitting across from investigators, he appeared confused but not outwardly nervous. When asked if he knew a woman matching the victim's description, he shook his head without hesitation. "I don't know anyone like that," he insisted. At first, his reaction seemed genuine. His background supported his claim. He had no stable job, spent most of his time gambling, and, according to friends and family, had never been in a serious relationship. But the DNA didn't lie. When investigators revealed that he was the biological father of the unborn child, everything changed. Li Qiang froze. The color drained from his face as the reality hit him. His earlier confidence disappeared, replaced with confusion and disbelief. He struggled to process what he was hearing. "That's impossible," he muttered. But as the questioning continued, cracks began to appear in his story. Under pressure, he finally admitted that about a year ago he had traveled to Linghai. During that trip, he had stayed in a small roadside hotel. Lonely and frustrated after losing money, he had sought out the services of a woman through a local intermediary. He claimed it was a one-time encounter. He didn't know her real name, he barely remembered her face. But he did remember one thing: the person who arranged the meeting, a woman known locally as Mei Lin. That name became the next lead. Investigators moved quickly, tracking down Mei Lin through local records and informants. What they uncovered was a web of illegal activities: prostitution, underground gambling, and connections to organized crime. When brought in for questioning, Mei Lin initially denied everything, but faced with mounting evidence, she eventually began to talk. She confirmed that Li Qiang had contacted her during his visit. Unable to fulfill his original request involving a criminal contact, she had introduced him to a young woman who had recently entered her network, a newcomer, someone vulnerable, someone easy to forget. She called herself Xiao Yu, but that wasn't her real name. That single detail reopened the case. For the first time in nearly a year, they had a path forward. But what they didn't yet realize was just how dark that path would become. With the name Xiao Yu as their only lead, investigators began the painstaking process of uncovering the victim's true identity. They knew that aliases were common in underground networks, especially among women working under intermediaries like Mei Lin. That meant Xiao Yu could be anyone. The team turned to data analysis. They pulled hotel registration records from the period Li Qiang had stayed in Linghai, focusing on women between the ages of 20 and 30 who had checked into nearby budget hotels around the same dates. Dozens of names surfaced. Many were incomplete, some likely fake, but it was a starting point. Photographs linked to identification records were compiled and shown to Mei Lin. She studied them one by one, her expression unreadable. Then, suddenly, her finger stopped. "This one," she said quietly. The woman in the photograph had soft features, a calm expression, and eyes that seemed far too gentle for the life she had been pulled into. According to official records, her real name was Lin Mei Yu. That name changed everything. Within hours, investigators accessed her household registration file. Lin Mei Yu was originally from a small coastal village in Hainan province. She had left home at a young age, like many others, chasing the promise of a better life in the city. But like countless stories before hers, reality had been far harsher. The investigation team traveled to her hometown. When they arrived, they found a modest house where her aging parents still lived. The moment officers mentioned their daughter's name, the atmosphere shifted. They hadn't heard from her in over 2 years. At first, they believed she had simply cut off contact, perhaps out of shame or hardship. But as the officers gently explained the situation, hope drained from their faces. DNA samples were collected from her parents for confirmation. Days later, the results came back. It was her. The mutilated body found in the river belonged to Lin Mei Yu. The confirmation hit the investigation team hard, but it also gave them direction. Now that they knew who she was, they could begin reconstructing her life in Linghai, her movements, her contacts, and most importantly, the people closest to her before her death. Phone records became the next key. Forensic analysts retrieved her call history from the months leading up to her disappearance. Among dozens of numbers, one stood out. It appeared frequently, often with long call durations, especially during late hours. The number was registered to a man named Zhao Wenlong. Unlike Li Qiang, Zhao was not a drifter. He was a well-dressed, well-spoken employee at a large insurance firm in the city. On paper, his life was stable. He had a wife, a young son, and a respectable career. But when officers approached him at his workplace, his composure cracked almost instantly. He tried to remain calm, but the tension in his face was obvious. His answers were short, vague, and inconsistent. Within minutes, investigators knew he was hiding something. He was brought in for formal questioning. Inside the interrogation room, Zhao sat quietly at first, avoiding eye contact. But as the evidence was presented, the call logs, the timeline, and the confirmed identity of Lin Mei Yu, his resistance began to crumble. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What followed was a confession that revealed the truth behind the horrific crime. Zhao Wenlong had met Lin Mei Yu several months before her death. What began as a transactional relationship slowly turned into something more complicated. He became attached to her, not out of love, but out of obsession and control. In her, he found an escape from his routine life. But everything changed when Lin Mei Yu became pregnant. At first, Zhao didn't believe the child was his, but as time passed, Lin Mei Yu began insisting that he take responsibility. She contacted him more frequently, her tone shifting from hopeful to desperate. She wanted stability. She wanted a future for her child. For Zhao, it was a nightmare. He knew that if the truth came out, his marriage, his career, his entire life would collapse. The pressure built slowly, turning fear into resentment and resentment into something far darker. On the night of January 11th, Zhao invited Lin Meiyu to his apartment. At first, the conversation was calm, but it didn't stay that way for long. An argument broke out. She demanded that he acknowledge the child. He refused. Voices were raised, accusations were thrown back and forth, and then, in a moment Zhao would later describe as losing control, he lunged at her. He forced her onto the bed and wrapped his hands around her neck. It didn't take long. When he let go, she wasn't moving. Silence filled the room. That was the moment everything became irreversible. Zhao sat there staring at her body, trying to process what he had done. But instead of calling for help, fear took over. He wasn't thinking about her, he was thinking about himself. In a desperate attempt to cover up the crime, Zhao made a decision that shocked even the investigators hearing it. He chose to dismember the body. Over the next several hours, he carried out the act with cold determination, wrapping the remains in layers of cloth. Under the cover of night, he disposed of different parts of the body in separate locations along the Qinshui River, believing it would prevent identification. For a time, it worked. Months passed. No one connected the crime to him, until the river gave up its secret. The discovery of the torso had set everything in motion. The DNA from the unborn child had led to Li Qiang. That single connection had unraveled the entire case, piece by piece, until it pointed directly to Zhao. But there was a final twist. Further analysis confirmed that the child Lin Meiyu carried was not Zhao's. It belonged to Li Qiang, the man who had met her only once. When Zhao learned this during interrogation, he broke down completely. The crime he had committed to protect his life had been built on a false assumption. In the end, it changed nothing. He was charged with murder, destruction of a body, and multiple related offenses. In court, the full extent of his actions was laid bare. The brutality, the calculated cover-up, and the complete disregard for human life left little room for leniency. The sentence was severe. As the case closed, it left behind more than just a record of crime. It was a story of desperation, deception, and irreversible choices. Lin Meiyu had come to the city searching for a better life. Instead, she became trapped in a world that slowly consumed her. And in the end, both she and her unborn child paid the price for someone else's fear. For the investigators, it was a reminder that even the most carefully hidden truths have a way of surfacing. Sometimes, all it takes is one small piece to bring everything to light.